Hola, welcome to season 3 of More Than Rice and Beans, the Mother Son podcast where we introduce you to our favorite Latinx creators, innovators, and entrepreneurs.
I'm Miguel, a mechanical engineer PhD student at Johns Hopkins University, funded by a NASA fellowship.
And I'm his mom, Tanya. I'm a chef, educator, and proud New Yorican.
This season on More Than Rice and Beans, we've got, well, a lot more for you. More amazing guests, more ridiculous sidebar conversations, and more meaningful discussions on what it's like to navigate this world as a Latinx person.
We're so excited you're joining us for this incredible season, along with our all-star lineup of guests. Get ready, because this time it's way more than rice and beans.
Welcome back to More Than Rice and Beans, the mother-son podcast where we talk about Latin food, culture, life, and more. I'm Miguel, the son.
And I'm his mom, Tanya. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode. Today, we have an incredible guest. Carlos Freyes is a longtime journalist and the host of Sundial, a daily show on the South Florida NPR affiliate station where he shares the stories that make Miami wonderful and weird. He was awarded not one, but 2 James Beard Awards for his work as food editor at the Miami Herald, including the 2022 Jonathan Gold Local Voice Award for engaging the community with his food writing. He's also the author of an incredible memoir, Take Me With You, A Secret Search for a Forbidden Family in Cuba, in which he recounts his journey to connect with his ancestry. Carlos, thank you so much for joining us today on More Than Rice and Beans.
Oh man, it's such a pleasure to be here with you guys. After following Tanya's recipes online for so long, I'm glad to be here talking about food and life and culture and whatever else.
First, I want to congratulate you on your 2nd James Beard Award for your work with Miami Herald. It is so well deserved, and I'm thrilled for you. How did it feel to win for the 2nd time?
Oh, it was totally unexpected. And I mean that honestly because the biggest thing that happened to me that weekend is that I got engaged. So
congratulations!
It was in Chicago, and it's a special city for my fiance and I, and I'd already been planning a trip there to propose when I got the nomination. So I said, this is great. It gives me cover to go up and propose, and like she'll never see it coming. And she said yes, and the very next day I won the James Beard, so it was icing on top of the cake.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah, that's perfect timing. Just back to back.
I mean, it could have been a terrible weekend, right? She could have said no, and I could have lost, and then
yeah, that's true.
I could have been living under a bridge in Chicago.
So you took that chance. So, I grew up in New York City with my mom, and I was very connected to Puerto Rican culture through my mom and through constantly visiting Puerto Rico to see family. So I know you grew up in South Florida, and you were kind of immersed in Cuban culture. I mean, Miami is like a Cuban, everyone there is like speaks Spanish and everything. So it's a huge center for Cuban culture. But you were never able to set foot in Cuba until you were much older. So what was the experience of having that kind of dichotomy between the two cultures?
It was it's something that a whole generation of Cuban American kids lived with. We inherited this culture and this memory from our parents, and from a thing that they created here. So you always grew up with this language and this culture and this background, but yet you're in America and you have no connection to this place that they're talking about. They build memories and images in your mind. Anecdotes built these paisajes, in your memory, and so going was like this. Was like going to this forbidden place, this place that you never think that you imagine you're going to be able to go, because it in very many ways it still is a forbidden country, and especially at the time when I went, it was there were not, the relations between Cuba and the United States were even not as good as they are now, as bad as they are now. They still weren't as good. So it felt like taking this big unexpected leap of faith, you know. For me, I felt like it kind of became the intro to my book. I felt like I needed to get my dad's permission. You know, I mean, my dad spent 2 years in a prison. He spent 2 years in an agricultural prison camp, you know, digging latrines and things like that. You basically for trying to leave the island. So he tried to leave the island on a speedboat, kind of quote unquote illegally leave, because they weren't granting visas to leave the country anymore. Right after, in 1960. So he spent 2 years in prison for trying to leave. And then when you're out, they say, okay, if you still want to leave, you have to do 2 years of agricultural labor. So it doesn't matter if you were a doctor or you were already a farmer, which is what my dad had been for most of his life. You had to go work in these fields. And, so for a person then to leave that, and stay stamped that your passport is invalid, and then have your son, have this chance to go, I felt like I had to ask his permission to go. And I was surprised when I said, Dad, the newspaper, Dad, I'm going to Cuba. And then I explained to him that the newspaper wanted to send me to Cuba. He says to me, after he thinks for a long time, he says, take me with you. Because you can imagine, he hadn't been home for almost 50 years. And so that's what I try to do is when I try to go, I went as a reporter I was working at a newspaper at the time called the Palm Beach Post. And so I tried to bring back stories and try to take him with me, so to speak, in that way. I tried to bring those stories back with me and take the stories that he told me over the years with me to Cuba and to help illuminate my trip. So it was like a before and after in my life, being able to go, for sure.
And did your family try to kind of keep all of those cultural values and traditions while you were growing up in Miami? Like make it kind of like their own Cuba in America?
Yeah, absolutely. You don't realize how insular South Florida can be until you get outside of it, because they've created a community. They landed here and they created a whole community that you can only speak Spanish for your entire life if you want and get by, and that's something really particular, especially in a place like Florida. Like Florida is such a traditionally older, white, conservative state. And then you have this very Latin culture in Miami, and it's like this little bubble outside of the rest of the state. So it is really interesting how you have an influx of language, you have an influx of culture, food, like food traditions. There are food traditions that only exist in Miami. And then on top of that, like there are other thriving cultures here. The Haitian community, the Bahamian community, which was one of the biggest Black communities in South Florida to begin with. And it's interesting to watch how all those cultures and flavors and dialects melt. It's funny because we have some people that are like, they consider themselves gringos, Americano, that grew up in Miami, who don't speak Spanish, but their accent sounds like they do. Their English accent sounds like they do speak Spanish. It's wild.
Yeah, actually, I went to like a band camp where my percussion teacher was the principal timpanist of the Florida Orchestra, and he lived in Miami for several years and played in Miami. And he could speak Spanish better than me, and it's because he like lived in Miami for so long and really interacted with the people there, that he was like, yeah, if you want to learn Spanish, don't go to a Spanish speaking country, go to Miami.
That's pretty good advice.
I always thought that's funny, because if you go to touristy spots in these Latin American countries, sometimes like they actually speak more English than Spanish. But if you go to Miami, it's like everyone speaks Spanish.
Everyone speaks as much English or as much Spanish as you want.
Yeah.
It's pretty funny. Yeah.
So did you ever feel at odds between your Cuban roots and just growing up as an American teenager, American kid?
It's one of those things. It's your life is whatever it is. You don't know any different. And it wasn't probably until I got to college that I realized that what a specific culture I had grown up in, where I started seeing kids from, all over the world that were now going to school with me. I went to the University of Florida, which is in Gainesville, which is not, it's maybe a 5 hour drive from Miami, but it might as well be South Georgia. Like, it's totally different culturally. And then you have this influx of kids. So there was never so much of a struggle growing up, but going out, I realized that I'd been fortunate to kind of grow up in a way, fortunate to grow up in this little bubble, where it was okay to speak Spanglish and it was okay to bring Cuban food to school. And even though I grew up in a little bit more of American part, like I grew up just north of Miami in a little town called Miramar, which is right across the Dade-Broward border. So that county line is very much like an asymptote. People they go close, but they almost never cross on a daily basis. So I did go to school with a lot of kids who were, really American kids, and it was funny to see kids, go to school with their peanut butter and jellies. And I had, my mom would, have like leftover ropa vieja or something. So it was definitely like, you look around the room and you're like, oh, I am, and my things are a little different.
So when you said you went to Cuba and it inspired you to write your memoir, Take Me With You. Is that what your father said, right? Take me with you? That's
Mm-hmm.
what inspired the title of the memoir. Now I'm connecting both. Can you tell us a little bit about, you mentioned your experience there, but tell us a little bit more about your experience when you arrived. Where was the first place you went to as soon as you arrived to Cuba, besides the hotel, of course?
Where I set up to begin with was in Old Havana. So, Cuba has a section in the city of Havana has an old section that was, the oldest part. And I remember going for a walk and kind of like going to this section. They're like, oh, this is the touristy section. You should go see it, because I was going as a journalist. So I really wanted to get also an image of like, what does Cuba look like and feel like now? And I went down this section and, the buildings were nicely painted. Like the street where I was walking on, I think it's called San Obispo or just Obispo. And the storefronts are beautifully painted, and you see, the United Colors of Benetton. There's national department stores, and there's the Floridita bar, which is supposedly where Hemingway drank. And you're like, oh, this is so like, this is so quaint. And, in a way, like people have told me that it was very similar to Puerto Rico in parts, to San Juan, to old San Juan. And I was like, oh, okay, I get that, And then I turned down one of these side streets, and there's no more paint on the walls, and the concrete is cracked, and the fire escapes are all askew, and you keep walking, and there's a building that's kind of crumbled, and you can tell it's been laying there for 20 years in crumbled chunks, and there are little kids running around barefoot, and there's, you can smell and you can tell that like there's sewage like on parts of the street, and there's piles of garbage on a corner, and you realize that, oh, Cuba is very much about appearances, in the sense that like, I had been to Haiti. I've been to, the Dominican Republic, like on the very edge of Haiti, and seen kind of like some real, like, what we tend to call third world poverty, and that, once you get away from the parts where they try to make it really nice, you realize, oh wow, Cuba is really like the rest of the poorest parts of the Caribbean in parts, and then you really start to see, el abandono, right? Like and that hit me the most, because I still do have, at the time I did have family there. My mom's sister was in Cuba and was never able to leave, and she lived in really dire conditions, in an old house, with like a bunch of other families, and same thing, the crumbling walls. And it's really stunning to see a place kind of frozen in time, and not in a like a cute way, not in like a, because we see the pictures of the old cars and you're like, oh, that's pretty cool, but that's really kind of only the surface, and it was tough. It was tough though. It was 2 weeks, and a lot of it was really moment of reckoning of seeing, really seeing people struggle to try to make it every day. It was
Yeah.
hard.
Hmm. Was the food what you expect it to be?
Oh no, the food was totally different. Yeah. So I remember going into a bar, and they had a full menu of items at Floridita, and because I was like, oh, this is a touristy spot, I'll get something to eat here. And like there was none of the dishes that I recognized as a kid growing up. There was no ropa vieja on the menu, there was no vaca frita, there was no Cuban sandwich, there was no sandwich, so to speak. It was like I don't even remember what I ate, because it was like culturally, like, so much of food is tied so much into our culture, so that I
Yeah.
expect, like, once you hear that language and it's like, oh, their accents are like ours, and you expect all these other things to be the same, and you realize that sometimes, your language is the only thing that you have in common, which is, I think, what a lot of people mistake about Latins in general. They hear Latinos speak Spanish and they say, oh, it's an all a monolith, and it's like, just from the Cubans in Miami to Cuba itself, there is such an incredible wide berth separation of belief and thought and culture, and the only thing that's the same is the language. And that's something that I think that a lot of people that are outside the Latin cultures, don't understand that, just because everybody speaks the same language doesn't mean that you're all, a cultural monolith. So yeah, it was odd to find a place where the food was so different, and I was like, they make a lot of pizza, right? Because pizza, yes,
Wow.
pizza was super common in Cuba, everywhere you went.
How was it?
It was odd. It was very different. So like the dough, it's a big deal here in Miami too. We have quote unquote Cuban pizza, which is like a real thick, pillowy dough. Imagine like a pan pizza, but without the edge. So like a puffy dough, and then like a sweet. The sauce is very sweet, and it's topped with like a cheese. The cheese, they use a lot of they obviously make a lot of their own cheeses. So the cheeses have a lot of like almost like a goat milk flavor, like a
Okay.
very pungent, strong flavors. So like the pizza is totally wild, totally different, and you see it everywhere. And I guess it made sense, because to make pizza can be pretty cheap. I mean, it's flour
Yes.
and water,
Yeah.
uh, and that was really surprising. Like I remember I went to one place, and they had it said, the different kinds of pizza, and it said pizza de perro, and I was like, oh my god, la cosa está tan mala que la gente está comiendo perro. And what they do is
Oh
they
my
make
God.
they make hot dog pizza. So like little hot dog slices on top of the pizza. Esa es la pizza de
I,
perro.
oh my goodness. So
So
how
like
many of
that,
those pizzas did you eat?
I ate a lot of pizza in Cuba. That was the strangest thing. I
What
ate
about
a
rice
I'm
lot,
and
sure you didn't
beans?
expect to say that when you came back.
right? Right. It was odd. Yeah, and the other thing that rice and beans, you do find it at some restaurants, but my aunt, I had such a weird variety of different kinds of beans. It wasn't just like you had black beans. You had a lot of we had a lot of chicharo, so split pea.
Okay.
Um, I had a cousin of my dad's who's again now passed away, but he spent like he invited me over for tamales. He made tamales. There was a lot of pork. There was a lot of pork. So I was like, all right, that's still consistent. uh, so that was it was really interesting to see a whole different kind of cuisine, and also see what's available for tourists, because for tourists there were like Chinese restaurants and stuff like that. It was well, there Cuba has a big like a Chinatown, uh, and which they've had for a long time. There's a lot of Cuban chinos, and I remember going there with a guy who I'd hired as a driver. Like I just paid him to take me, everywhere the whole day, and I treated him to dinner there. I was like, "Come on in, we'll have dinner." He's like, "Really? Yeah, yeah, come on." And we ordered Chinese food, and he ordered a steak, so like a palomilla style, very thin steak with onions, like at the Chinese restaurant, which like okay. And what I learned later is that Cubans, regular nationals, don't have access to beef really. It's really reserved only to be sold at tourist locations. And like you can actually, for you to have beef, you usually have to have a prescription for it. You have to have a doctor write a prescription to say that you need the extra protein and to give you the ability to buy beef, which is it's crazy, right? It's
Yeah.
crazy.
It's also an odd prescription because beef actually has less protein content than like
It
chicken.
right? It's very strange. It's very strange. So, but I don't know. It was definitely a cultural awakening.
Some people say that Cuba is a bit unsafe. Did you feel unsafe there, or did you feel okay?
Well, I mean, it's been 10 years since I've been, so I can't say how it is today, but I felt safe. It's interesting because when it's nighttime, it's pitch black. Like yeah, it really like there's no, and that's very common in the Caribbean, I think too. But like when the sun goes down, there's very few street lights, and it is pitch black. And there's not a lot of cars driving around, and the cars that do have the old style, kind of like yellowish headlights,
Yeah.
and it feels like someone has just kind of turned down the lights, has dimmed down the whole lights. It's very wild. But no, I never felt unsafe when I was there.
Yeah, I was actually surprised because my girlfriend had the chance to go to Cuba like just a few years ago when
Hmm.
Obama had just made it available to people who like had a specific reason. And
Right.
for her, she's a trumpet player, a Latin, so she played at a Latin band, and so
Cool.
their excuse was that they were able to like play in Cuba as
Awesome.
part of the Latin band. And when she was there, she told me like, yeah, she felt more safe like walking in the streets of Havana at night than she does in New York City, which really surprised me. I didn't expect that at all.
Yeah, it felt really safe. And the truth is, like, there are not a lot of people walking around with guns in Cuba. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
like that's and by not a lot, like nobody, you know. So that part of it, yeah, I agree with her. I felt pretty safe too there.
Carlos, I must talk about food. Vamos a hablar de
Mhm.
comida otra vez. I
Yes.
love having you here because the story of your relationship with food is really the story of your life. This will make it easier for me to ask you hundreds of questions that I have. Okay, not 100, but close. For starters, can you give us a bit background on your dad's history with food and how it shaped your childhood?
Oh wow. So my dad, my mom was a great cook. She cooked many of the meals in our house. But my dad, I thought I didn't realize until later that it was odd to have a dad that cooked all the time, like that not every kid had that. So my dad, he grew up as a farmer in the farming region in Cuba, and then they later opened like that. The brothers moved a couple at a time to the capital city, and they started with a little cafeteria, a little kiosk selling coffee at 3 cents a cup, um, to then eventually having like a little restaurant. And the restaurant it was called, well, the cafeteria was called Mi Buchito Oriental because they were from El Oriente. And then the restaurant was called El Restaurante Oriental or something like that. And it was ironic because their main cook was a Chinese Cuban guy. So they had a lot of like part of the food was there was a lot of like Chinese influenced food at the restaurant. And so when my dad, and so then they opened, like they had a little juice stand, and then they had another little cafeteria called La Copa. And so they got into this whole kind of food business, food and drinks. So when my dad, gets arrested for trying to leave the country, um, and then he's working in the agricultural camp, the agricultural camps were really difficult. They were like I said, you were digging latrines, so like whole areas where people would go to use the bathroom, kind of like sewage areas. You were you were planting rice paddies, and there's like víboras, there's vipers and snakes in the. You're cutting sugar cane, it's very laborious work. Um, and the guy who was the cook, and so it's like a camp for 80 men, so it's only men, so it's a camp for 80 men. And the guy who's the cook gets his visa. His 2 years are up, and he gets his visa. And they ask, "Does anybody know how to cook?" And so my dad, because he'd worked in a restaurant and he'd watched the guy, he says, I'm a chef. I'm a chef. Yeah, anything to get out of working in those hard labor fields.
Yeah.
And so he started cooking for groups of 80 people.
That's huge.
And yeah, so imagine he started really learning how to be able to cook for these giant, masses of men. And one of my favorite stories was one of the days he was cooking, he saw that somebody had knocked down, like they were clearing land for different things, for planting or whatever, and they had knocked down these 4 huge palm trees. So he remembered a story that his father had told him, because his father's father, I think I want to say his father's father, so like my great grandfather, was in the Cuban War of Independence, and he remembers stories about the men that were hiding in the mountains, and like they were subsisting off the land. One of the things they subsisted off was hearts of palm, like fresh hearts of palm. So he remembered that, and he asked the men in the field, "Can you cut me out the hearts of palm from those 4 palms?" And they cut him these big, clean, 8-10 inch long, gleaming white hearts of palm. And the men had not eaten anything that was sweet, anything that was dessert. It was all chicharo and rice, like nonstop, like every day. So he had this crazy idea to take the hearts of palm and cook it down almost like if it was a dulce de calabaza china, or like a papaya type thing. So he cooked it down with like almira, like sugared water, and it was like they got their hands on some cinnamon or some star anise, and they cooked it down until it was like a soupy, syrupy thing. And that night they had like a little chalkboard, and he wrote down, today's menu: chicharo con arroz, split pea and rice, and dulce de palma frías. And he said that in his memory, like the men came in and they saw it and they were like, "What is this?" And everybody ate it, and they had their first sweet thing that some of them had in months, if not years. And the very next day, they cut down 8 palm trees. So, so my dad learned to cook like that, and it was really cool, because even here, he enjoyed it. He would. My parents had a little jewelry store, and in the back of the jewelry store, there was a tiny little stove, a 4-burner, tiny little apartment-sized 4-burner stove. And he would put on his apron, and he would go back there, and he would cook, a quick picadillo, or he might make una vaca frita or whatever. And that was just part of my growing up, is seeing my mom and my dad together in the kitchen, cooking and stuff like that. It was really cool. And that's how it is with, my fiance and my kids today. Like our kitchen is very much a hangout and a gathering place. And I find that, like, even when there's a little tension in the house, like when we're all in the kitchen cooking and doing something together, like when the kitchen is busy, the tensions all kind of seem to render out, because, how can you be upset when somebody's making you something delicious,
Yeah, that's true.
And it smells great.
It does. It does.
I feel like the aromas of the cooking and seeing your mom and dad in the kitchen, that brings so many beautiful memories, things that you can hold on to for the rest of your life. Do you feel like you're recreating that with your children too?
Yeah, I definitely feel like it's had an effect that, like they see cooking as a way to, like, feed yourself and feed others and show people gratitude and show people affection. It's funny, my oldest daughter, who's 19, has a boyfriend she's been dating for a year or two, a couple years. And anytime that I'm cooking, she's like, "Oh, you got to come over. My dad's cooking today."
Oh,
And that feels so great. Like just this week alone, I made a picadillo. I hadn't done it in a while because we're not eating a lot of red meat. So I was like, I'm going to make my picadillo on Wednesday. Ahí estaba, the table was full, and there was the boyfriend, like, having picadillo. He's a Venezuelan
That's
kid.
cute.
Yeah, he's a Venezuelan kid, so he didn't grow up on picadillo. So he was like, "Oh my God, this is amazing!" And all the kids hate it when I put raisins in the picadillo.
oh gosh.
but like this kid was like, I kind of like it, and he's like, of course he likes it. These Venezuelans, they eat sweet, they put sweet things in others, and so my kids
Yeah.
hate it, but he liked it. And I was like, finally, I have an ally at this table.
Yeah.
So now you approve of the boyfriend.
I do. You know what? I do. For sure. If he likes olives and raisins in his picadillo, he's in.
So before we end up back at food, can you tell us a bit about how you got into journalism?
Yeah, if you do journalism for a long time, you end up covering a lot of different areas. And I got into it as a sports writer. So I got into it in college, writing about college sports. I was going to school at the University of Florida, and I started writing. And the teams at the University of Florida, incidentally, got very good. Like they got a lot of national attention. And I got a job as a correspondent with the newspaper from my hometown, the Sun Sentinel, which is in Fort Lauderdale. And they basically said, we'll pay you to write, stories from the football team. And I just started writing stories about sports, and I did that for, most of my career was writing about sports. I did that for well over 10 years, like probably 10 or 15 years. And then I started writing, I really was fascinated about people's stories, not necessarily the sports, but the people behind the sports. And that's kind of what is interesting to me now too. The people behind the food, there's always the people that were involved in the stories, the things that made the news headlines, and that's how I got into it. So I've covered things in business, and, I've covered, kind of crime to now food, and I really just always appreciate the people behind the stories. And that's why I still do it.
And it seems like you write a lot of in-depth profiles. Is there something from your background or just how you grew up that kind of played into that?
I mean, I always think that my dad was a big storyteller, I had such vivid memories of even Cuba and his growing up, because he was so good at telling stories. And my dad, those what they call los guajiro, like the old school farmers in Cuba, they call them guajiros. They think the name comes from war hero, because those mambises, those early fighters fought alongside the U.S. to get during the Spanish American War, to get to, which is what separated Cuba from being a Spanish territory. And so that group of those mambises, they call them that, they think that's where the name Guajiro came from. But really it becomes these country folks con machete, and part of the traditions is these kind of these poesias, these dicharachos, these making up this, Punto Guajiro is a big thing, where it's it's Punto Guajiro is a cross between music and poetry, kind of self-written limericks, that go along with music.
Interesting.
Things my dad would say. He would say, here's one. He'd say tun 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 tun. Oye Carlito, ven acá que yo te quiero cantar. Y aquí te puedes quedar y cuando quieras te vas. Tun 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 tun.
Very
So
cute. You have a great
play
voice.
music. No. Please don't say that. It's terrible.
Yes, it's great.
So it's little things like that, and so my dad, and then he had a lot of little poems growing up, little poems that he taught to me, and that I taught to my daughters, and he taught to my daughters over the years. So every one of those little poems has a little story behind it. There's one that my daughters recited at his funeral, and it was one of his favorites. It said it was called La Tortola, and it's a famously known story, in those in that old tradition. And it was how is it? I think it goes, Tortola mía, sin estar presa, echa mi cama, echa mi mesa, un beso ahora y otro después. ¿Por qué te has ido? ¿Qué fuga es esa cimarronzuela de rojos pies? Ver hojas verdes solo te incita, el fresco arroyo tu pico invita, te llama el aire que susurró. Ay de mi tórtola, mi tortolita, que al monte has ido, y allá quedó. So like those little poems all are a full story. Like that's like, this whole story of loss. Like my daughter, my oldest, when she was little, she would say it and her eyes would fill up with tears. Like the, oh, la tortola has flown off into, into the mountains, and I think that that's where I got my love for storytelling, is like I just kind of grew up hearing those little stories.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that with us. It almost made me cry. Okay.
It is very touching. It's all those little things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did you end up in food writing specifically? How did you make that transition?
Well, I have this really great friend. Her name is Liz Balmaceda, who was a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner at the Miami Herald. And she later started as the food editor of the Palm Beach Post, where I was working. And I was just starting to write general features, and like outside of sports, but like people in the community that were interesting, that had great stories to tell. And she said, you can tell great stories through food. And she gave me a couple assignments and a couple ideas, and I started writing about these different folks who owned a restaurant, folks who were selling los tamales, folks who started a hot dog shop, and everybody had these places that not only were turning out food that like catches your attention, like, oh, this is really good, but then they had this great story behind it. And I realized that was a way that you really tie the community together. You can really, like, now when people go to like try that Cuban sandwich that I read about in the Miami Herald, oh, I know that the guy is from such and such a place, and I went to that high school too, and like that community feels more connected than if it's just like a McDonald's drive-through, and I found that I got a lot of great feedback, and that's really nice. As a writer, you want people to read your stuff, and you also want to know that they enjoyed it, that it made their life more interesting, and I think that's why I like doing it.
So I love that you are writing now is just so Miami. I generally believe in the power of excellent meal to transport you anywhere in the world. And you do the same thing in your writing. Every piece takes me out of New York into Miami. And of course, you're writing about food, which is a bonus. What is it about Miami food scene that is so special?
Well, I think growing up, like I mentioned, I grew up just north of Miami, and like all of my family, except my dad, my mom and my dad, lived in the heart of Miami. So, like, I had this yearning to be part of this town. So, when I had a chance to, even before I started working at the Herald, I moved to Miami. When I said I want to live in not like metropolitan Miami, like I want to live in the heart of where all the culture is. Like I live in the very central part of the city of Miami. And I grew up with that wanting to know, to understand. So I still go about my day with a fascination learning about different things and things that catch my attention and things that I know that are very different. So I always look for stories that could only happen here. Like this could
Okay.
only happen in Miami. That's really my driving force. Like before I decide to write about something, I say, is this so unique? Could this be written about in New York? Could this be written about in Brooklyn? Or is this a very Miami story? And that's really what my ultimate goal is finding those and then telling the story behind those.
This year, Florida received the first ever Michelin guide with Miami, bringing home the most stars 11 one-star restaurants and the state's only two-star restaurant. What effect has this had on the food scene there?
I think it's only a couple months old since we got it, so I think it remains to be seen. But I think what it means is that Miami's on an international stage. So the Michelin Guide really is for international travelers. Miami's been a really international city for a long time. It's the hub to Latin America, but also to Europe. Like we get a lot of direct travel, especially, we have a lot of Italy connection, a lot of Italian connections. And I think that when you're on the guide, it becomes a roadmap for a whole other group of people to discover what you're doing in food. So I think it works hand in hand. It's great because it's an international destination, and it becomes an international destination because of the food. So like both of those things, they help each other. And I think it remains to be seen, like how it'll help in the day to day. But I think it helps solidify Miami as uh, you know, it um, gives it another stronghold as a tourist destination. But for those of us who live here, I think it's just maybe a point of pride. That you're a
Yeah.
little bit on the map, more so. Um, but our favorite places are still our favorite places. Whether they get a Michelin star or not. I want to add one thing before I forget. So,
Oh, sure.
when I started writing about food, I started looking for people who were doing it in really good ways, people that were interesting to me. And I came across this podcast called The Sporkful, and it was done by
Oh,
Dan Pashman, who's out of New York. And I fell in love with so many of the episodes and how he told stories about food through audio, and that's where I discovered you. So like I remember he was doing a whole story about coquito, and I loved like that whole episode is fantastic because the Cuban tradition is like every Latin American country has its own version of like a cream style holiday drink. Whether
yeah.
it has eggs or whether it doesn't have eggs, but it all has got, and it usually has its whatever the local alcohol is. Like Peru does one with pisco, and someplace might do one with aguardiente, uh, and and I remember hearing about the coquito, because my parents grew up when I was growing up. They always made a big vat of crema de vie, which was the big one that's in Cuba.
Okay,
Uh,
yeah. Because
they
I was
they
gonna
made
say in Cuba, coquito is a little tiny dessert, right? It's
Yeah,
named. Okay.
exactly. It's like a chewy little coconut, almost like a macaroon, like a coconut macaroon. That's like what a coquito is. So I grew up with crema de vie on the holidays, but I remember having coquito, and I was like, "This is amazing! Like this is the best version of these cream drinks." And I remember that, and I remember the recipe that you use, and it was like a quote unquote light coquito because you don't put eggs in it, which I've
No.
come to learn means that makes it into ponche, which is something else. Which
Yeah.
I love that it's a whole separate. You have separate categories of
Yes.
alcohol based cream drinks, and I made that once for the very first holiday party that I was at the Miami Herald, and there was already somebody on staff who made a great coquito that everybody was like, "Oh, she makes the best coquito," and I made yours, and everybody was like, "Oh my god, this is the new best coquito in town."
Oh my God.
Yeah, and it
That's
was a hit. And every year I make crema de vie from a great recipe from a friend of mine who she wrote a great cookbook called The Cuban Table, which was nominated for a James Beard Award. And
we're gonna look that up.
her crema de vie recipe is fantastic. It's the best one that I've had. And I make that, and we make your light coquito recipe, and that's how we get through the holidays.
Oh, I love it. I love it. Thank you. Thank you. Oh my
It's
God, I'm
fantastic.
blushing.
It's fantastic. It's
That's
so good.
definitely how we get through the holidays too. I love
Yes, yes. And I gotta say that just to add on that, because you brought it out there to the light and you talked about it on Twitter and how popular it was, people got really curious and they just reached out to me. They wanted to learn how to make it. They signed up for my classes. I mean, like I'm thinking you can get the recipe online, but they rather that I teach it to them, which is kind of cool. It makes me feel important, I guess, special.
Yeah, no, it's
It's a
great.
yeah, it's a lot of
It's
fun.
definitely not the same. Like I feel like there has to be tips that like you can't put on a recipe because like I've tried. I mean, I followed your coquito recipe to the T, and it still does not taste like when you make it. When you make it is still way better than when I've made it.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to do with the class too is sort of lead people to like the history of coquito, the how my grandmother tried to, you know, she was like a scientist in the kitchen trying to figure out the right spices, the right measurement, the right everything. And when you give the recipe to somebody online, there is just like the measurements have to be so exact, like in baking almost, that if you put too much of nutmeg, guess what? It's going to taste terrible.
Yeah.
So I just make sure that everybody just follows to the point every measurement, in the class. So I guess that's what makes it a little bit different than following the recipe.
Yeah, no, I would love that. That sounds like a great experience to be able to do that and learn, why you're putting in what you're putting in, you know. But I experiment with it a little bit every year. Like one year's I'll use, you know, Don Q rum, and next year I'll use Ron Diplomatico, you know, and then 1 year, you know, I'll use this kind of coconut milk, and next year I'll try a different one and see, you know, which one we like best here. But they're all
Yeah.
start from the mother recipe.
Yeah, yeah. I think that you can change the milk and everything. It's just the spices have to be like the right ones always.
Really perfect, really
And
on point.
yes, and fresh, because if you use old spices, forget about it. It's not going to taste the same.
It's not going to taste the same, no.
If I asked your kids what is their favorite meal that you cook, what do you think their answer would be?
Oh man, that's a tough one. The picadillo's up there. They love when I make you're gonna laugh. They love when I make pizza because I like.
Is it the
like,
Cuban pizza or regular
No,
pizza?
it is regular pizza. I make it with, you know, Italian OO flour, so that it's like the dough is really nice, and I ferment it 3 days I cold ferment it in the fridge so that the bread turns out really nice. So they love pizza. Those are always winners, and they love when I make pan con lechon. Like that's their other favorite. Like in my house, like sandwiches take the same level of respect as like you could serve them for Thanksgiving, as far as I'm concerned, you know. Like I love making, you know, big sandwiches to the point where I recently just asked the owner of Versailles. Versailles is probably the most famous Cuban restaurant outside of Cuba, and it's in Miami. It's been here for 50 years. I asked him, hey, can you help me source a commercial sandwich press? And from their kitchens, they found me like this really monster sandwich press. If you look on my Twitter feed, you'll find it there. And it's an actual commercial sandwich press. And I had everybody over yesterday, and I made, you know, these big sandwiches, you know, with, you know, jamón viejo and jamón de pierna and, you know, gallo azul cheese, Gouda cheese. And I make like a special sauce that goes on it with, you know, it's like a quote unquote secret sauce, you know, like mayo, mustard, ketchup, sriracha, you know, diced onions, diced pickles, you know, salt and pepper, you know, a little horseradish, you know, that on the sandwiches. I put chorizo cantimpalo. Basically, I make these big fat sandwiches and I butter them up and I press it on this big commercial press, and they taste amazing. And it's like I'm at the next level. I think I might have a problem.
But that must feel so cool using the giant sandwich press.
Yeah, it is fantastic. It's probably it's got to be like 18, 19 inches across, almost 2 feet across, and it's like 17 inches deep. It's this big giant square, and it cranks up to 550 degrees. Like it's like a monster. Like it is a full on commercial thing, and you know what? It is totally worth it.
Wow. Okay, so you know my next question is going to be, where do you keep it?
I honestly make room for it on the kitchen counter. Like, you know, we have an L-shaped counter, and like on one end of the L-shaped counter is my stove, and it kind of makes an L like this, and on this end by the fridge, boom, I have it right there. I'll send you a picture of it. But I think
it's always ready to go.
It's ready to go. You know what's funny is I have to actually move it to my island. I have an island right in the middle, you know, in our kitchen. And I plug it in there because the circuit that it's on currently, it's too strong for the circuit. So I have to have an electrician to come in. But I'm committed.
You gonna rewire your home for the sandwich press?
Oh man, totally. Listen, in for a penny, in for a pound, man. I'm ready to do it.
So besides being a food editor for the Miami Herald and making a ton of sandwiches for a lot of people, you also host a podcast called La Ventanita. So can you tell us a bit about the name of that podcast and what's the message and what you guys are trying to do with it?
Totally. So in Miami, our Ventanitas are these Cuban coffee walk-up windows. You find them all over town, where you can walk in, and it's literally just a little sliding window on the side of restaurants and Cuban places, and that's where you get your café cubano or your colada to share, and it's kind of where people meet. People meet to talk and have a snack and catch up with each other at La Ventanita, and then we go on with our lives. So I thought, what a great name for the podcast, is like a meeting place where we all meet and we exchange ideas and we hang out for a little bit. And I do the podcast with my good friend Amy Reyes, who is a white American girl from Detroit who is married to a Dominican TV star. So her Spanish is as good as, probably better than most people who grew up in Spanish speaking countries. And she's lived in Miami forever. So she's got a Detroit vibe, and she's got a Miami. She understands Miami, and she speaks great Spanish, and she's super funny. So we do it. And we have a good time. We try to have a laugh, and we try to invite a guest every now and then, every other week or every week, to just come in and talk with them a little bit about food and culture and Miami and everything else.
Yeah, and has the podcast helped you connect with the community, especially during the pandemic?
Yeah, I think so, because we're doing it remote. We can get to a lot of people. Also, it gives us a chance to talk to people who maybe are not quote unquote newsworthy. Like they haven't just opened a restaurant, or they haven't just come up with a new recipe, or they haven't done anything in that moment, but someone that we've been meaning to talk to for a long time, or someone that we just love talking with. That makes it fun. And we try to look for folks who have a Miami connection, so that the show feels very local and feels very like by Miami for Miami, kind of thing. And it's been fun to do so far.
I like it. I feel like Miami has so many stories, and it'll be very interesting to have it all in a podcast, especially Domino's Park, is it?
Yes. Yeah.
I'm sure all the hangouts there and everything, somebody can make a podcast of all the guys, old men, talking about Domino's and all the capicú and all this other stuff.
That would be an amazing podcast, the Domino podcast.
But I gave you the idea, okay? So you got to give me some credit.
All right, I'll do it.
All right, so are you ready for some rapid fire questions?
I'm ready.
Okay.
Let's do it.
All right. Best Cuban sandwich in Miami?
Wow. I can't say my kitchen, so I'm going to say Luis Galindo's Latin America has got the best Cuban sandwich.
Your favorite writer?
My favorite writer. God, it's too stuffy to say William Faulkner. I'm gonna say, I'm okay. I'm really enjoying Emily St. John Mandel right now.
Okay. Besides Miami, what is the best city for food in the U.S.?
Oof. Best city for food in the U.S. If I don't say New York City, everybody's going to get mad at me, right?
Yeah, definitely.
Yes.
All right. I'm gonna say Brooklyn.
Okay. Choose one to give up: Cuban coffee or air conditioning.
Woo! Wow. Can I say I'll give up air conditioning if I'm outside of South Florida, but if I'm in South Florida, I'll give up the Cuban coffee?
That works, yeah. I think that's fair. I think most people would say that's fair.
What terrible food do you love?
Oh, Arby's roast beef sandwiches. I will stand by it.
What advice would you give your younger self?
Don't take yourself so seriously. It's all going to be okay.
I like it. In one word, what does success mean to you?
Success to me means, in one word, to feel satisfied.
Nice. The best thing about being a food writer?
Getting to tell the stories of the people that make some of our favorite food.
Wonderful. Love it. Thank you. You're very inspiring.
Absolutely. No, it's a lot of fun. Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So now that you said that my mom's coquito is the best, I need to stop her from making a ton of t-shirts about it, because I'm sure she will. But thank you so much for joining us today on the show.
It has been my sincere pleasure, and I can't wait for the weather to start getting a little bit cool because that means it's going to be coquito time.
And thanks to our listeners for continuing to support the show. It means the world to us. If you'd like to drop us a review on Apple Podcasts or find other ways to help our show, check out the links in the show notes.
Carlos, congratulations again on a well-deserved success. I hope we can meet up for a Cuban meal sometime. Can you tell our listeners where they can find you?
Yeah, the best place to find me in the biggest public forum is on Twitter. You can find me at Carlos_Frias, Frias. You can also sometimes post publicly on Facebook, but don't count on it very often. And also just go to the MiamiHerald.com. All my stories are all archived there.
Wonderful. And if you're interested in learning more about coquito or other recipes, just visit us at cookieTheChef.com.
Tórtola mía, sin estar presa, echa mi cama, echa mi mesa, un beso ahora y otro después. ¿Por qué te has ido? ¿Qué fuga es esa cimarronzuela de rojos pies? Ver hojas verdes solo te incita, el fresco arroyo tu pico invita, te llama el aire que susurró. Ay de mi tórtola, mi tortolita, que al monte has ido y allá quedó.